Okay, we're going to turn to the chapter on gender, constructing gender and sexuality. So let's begin with and dig right into the PowerPoint, right, and the lecture. So here we go. So sex and gender. Okay, so sex, right, is a more biological leaning perspective. It's an individual's membership in one of two categories, male or female, based on biological factors. Okay, so we are a species, right? A binary species. It doesn't mean that that's the outcome necessarily, or the social construction or the social perspective, but how we function in our reproduction as a species is male, female. Okay. And that includes primary and secondary sex characteristics. Okay. Gender, different than sex, gender is the physical, behavioral, and personality traits that a group considers normal. So there's some social construction in there that a group considers normal, the social norm, for its male and female members. Okay. So that, and here's a diagram that may be a visual that'll help kind of better kind of a Venn diagram, right, where there is some overlap, right, in this kind of interesting, where we are as a society, right, as we have moved further down the road in socially constructing sex and gender. So sex, again, biological, right, the chromosomes, right, we're a species that has an XY or an XX chromosome. Now, there are I'm not a biologist, right, but we are common to an XY or an XX, but there are aberrations or deviations from that biological norm as well, right? So, and usually it's male, female, or intersex, right, are the most popular ones, right? As far as biological goes, chromosomes, sex organs, hormones, right? And then gender, right, is the socially constructed and enacted roles and behaviors, man, woman, other, masculine, feminine, gender non-conforming, even how we construct what is masculine, what is feminine, right? And what is non-binary and what is binary. And so, yeah, it's the thing about social constructions is changed over time. So an essentialist perspective is that there is this essential truth, essentialists, right? And you can use this in any type of academic study or conversation, right? Where it's a belief that there is this truth that can be found, right, and can be measured, and can be objective as opposed to subjective and postmodern socially constructed relativism, right? That would be the other end of the spectrum, right? So essentialists think there is this truth, you can find it, you can measure it to the degree that you can measure it, it is objective. Gender binary as opposed to non-binary. And a lot of these I'm going to go really quickly on because it's in your book and I don't want to repeat and regurgitate a lot of the same material you can get from a textbook. Constructionists, right? So social constructionists, we socially construct gender, right? And we give that meaning, right? The symbol is male or female or non-binary or transgender or cisgender. All those things have what a social construction to them. That's a constructionist view, right? That we give meaning to the symbols, right? And then we act based on those meanings, right? So gender identity, we present, right? We present ourselves, right, typically in different ways. Gender is one way that we identify, and then we present, ourselves because we say, hey, I belong to this group, and here's the socially constructed norm for this group, the ways we believe, the ways we think, the ways we talk and walk and act, right? And how we present ourselves, right? Again, going back to kind of a codes of gender, right? Goffman says, that commercial realism, right, he talks about how do we present masculinity and femininity? How do we present male and female in a single print ad where you have one image and you're trying to capture and hype, right, this presentation? And so he studied hands, of how women are shown to hold objects that, say, if I'm advertising for a mug, right, or a cup, typically women hold it open and loosely. Men would tend to be shown in pictures holding it, like this, or, like this, as opposed to maybe the pinky out or whatever. And so he noticed this pattern, right, because it's looking at patterns, and he said, ooh, there's a difference here. There's a difference in patterns between how men are shown and women are shown in relationship, right? And then he expanded from the hands to, men tend to look straight forward and they have their hands folded or hands in their pocket. Their feet are tended to spaced further out, whereas women tend to kind of, tilt their head and touch themselves, and that's more feminine, right? And that's socially, he looked at this, he said, well, this is socially constructed. And we'll get into that when later in this in this lecture, we'll look at gender role reversal, which can really illuminate and give you an idea of, wow, when you do a gender role reversal on social constructionism, it's like kind of an awakening moment. So we'll talk about that later. Cisgender is the gender that you were identified or born into, in birth, or identified as. Transgender is a change in gender. Again, I'm going to go over these quickly. You can look in the book for definitions and some further reading. So gender expression, we've talked a little bit about that. How do we express our genders, our sexuality, right, which is our attractiveness or our sexual orientation or identity, in that heterosexual, homosexuality, bisexuality, asexuality. I'll let you read those. Most of you know these already, and that's why I'm not going to spend too much time, but you have a textbook for clarity. Queer theory also is very interesting, as well as LGBTQ plus. And okay, socialization, okay, sex, gender, and sexuality. So gender role socialization, wow. And of course, the agents of gender role socialization and heteronormativity, right? So norming heterosexualism or heterosexism, right? Socially norming those things as kind of the norm, the social norm that's socially constructed. Gender role socialization, right, is how we socialize a little girl to become a grown woman, or a little boy to become a grown man, right? A lot of social influences and the agents of socialization. If you remember back to chapter 4 of socialization, right? If you look at, our entertainment industry and how men and women are presented in not only in commercials and print ads, but in music videos, for example, or in ads, or in books, right? Even children's books, right? How girls are presented differently than boys. These are all part of gender role socialization, right? And the messages that we get of, if you identify this is the norm for what that looks like, as far as how to think, how to act, how to talk, how to behave, how to dress, how to present yourself, right? And if you violate those norms, right, go back to the chapter on social deviance, if you violate those gender norms, right, then you get what? Sanctioned, right? You get sanctioned to the degree that you deviate, right? Deviate from those gender roles, right, that are socially constructed, right? You're a deviant if you deviate too far. So kind of interesting, right? And of course that changes, right? We can define deviance up, we can define deviance down, we can open up for a more inclusive society by expanding what the definition of what's the acceptable norms, right? And we still, even as we've opened it up more, we still have some social norms along the lines of sex and gender and sexuality, right? Even if you just think of this, the gender or the norms for sexuality, right? Sexual activity. It's like where it happens, when it happens, who's involved, all those things. You start thinking about that and you go, wow, we've got a lot of norms associated with sex and sexuality, right? So, which have changed over time as well, which is part of the social construction of, okay, social learning. Okay, we talked about the agents of socialization earlier, but family, schools, peers, media, religion, right? Sexism. So patriarchy or matriarchy is a male-dominated society. Matriarchy would be a female-dominated society. I think most social scientists would agree that we live in a patriarchal society where males tend to dominate, and we could, unpack kind of why that is probably. And I do think that's changing in a kind of our post-industrial society, as the physical differences of muscle and strength and size matter less today than they did, say, 200 years ago, right? We're taking averages, right? And it's not like here's a group and here's a group, men and women, right? It's here's a bell curve and here's a bell curve, and there's maybe a lot more than we think or than you might think similarities, right? Between male and female, of course, depending, height, there's a biological height difference. So as we've moved from a labor intensive physical industrial society, or a pre-industrial, which was agriculture or even hunting and gathering, and the distinguished roles, right, where men tended to be the hunters and women tended to be the gatherers, and the child care providers for biological survival reasons, right? In the 21st century, we've moved beyond that to where, and I think you'll see later, we'll look at some graphs where women are really kicking ass in this post-industrial information age. Privilege, right, is the unearned advantage accorded to members of dominant social groups, right? Tending today to be males, whites, physically abled, heterosexuals, wealthy, maybe people that are taller would be included in that as well. Maybe people that are beautiful, better looking, maybe people that have like a natural charisma, maybe IQs, people that are smarter, maybe people that live in suburbs as opposed to inner cities or rural, maybe religious or political affiliations would maybe fit in there. What else? So you get the point, right? How about age, right? Is that in there? No. Okay, so age might have some privileges to it, or subordinate status. Probably living in the United States probably is an unearned privilege, right? Being born in the United States or having the access to be in this country, or a Western civilization probably is a privilege, right? Probably historically thinking about maybe living in the 21st century is a privilege, right? Sexism, the belief that one sex, usually male, is superior to other sexes, right? So that's sexism. So if you believe that one sex is superior to another sex to the degree, right, that's the degree of sexism. And of course, misogyny is an ingrained prejudice against women, and it comes out in dislike, contempt, or hatred of women, right? That's misogyny. Misogyny is a hatred of women. And I suppose, and I've heard people talk about this, like a hatred of women, even if you're female, like a self-hatred can be kind of a misogynistic perspective. Misandry is a hatred of against or a prejudice against men, or a dislike or contempt for men. That's misandry, right? Prejudice, right, is any idea about the characteristics of a group that is applied to all members. So kind of a stereotype, right? Now you can have generalities, right, that we as sociologists like to talk in terms of, well, it's a generality, right, because there's data that supports, right, the average or the mean or these characteristics, right, that are patterns, and we call those generalities. And we kind of get away with that a little bit in sociology, I think. And that's important, right? It's important to, but it's supported by data, where prejudice and stereotypes tend to be maybe not cognitively assertive and aware of using this data, right? So it's an idea about characteristics that is then applied to all members, and it's unlikely to change regardless of the evidence against it. See, so prejudice kind of is oftentimes can be against the data or evidence. And then discrimination, right, is the application of prejudice put into action, right? So unequal treatment of individuals based on their membership in a certain social group. In the case of gender or sex or sexism or sexual orientation, would be a group. And, again, going back to the other chapters, we've talked about this, right? That we are a species, we are a people that tend to group together, and we tend to other groups and other people and categorize and stereotype and create an us and them instead of a uniting. So yeah, it's just fascinating and sad to some degree, but we can, because we have cognitive abilities, right? We can work to change that to be what? Inclusive, right? That's hard to do, especially when you have people monetizing our divisiveness, monetizing our tribalism, right? Encouraging that so they can monetize us in that way. Yeah, it's interesting, right? Remember, and kind of sneaky too. So it's usually motivated by prejudice, discrimination. Okay, hegemonic and toxic masculinity. Okay, so homophobia or transphobia, right, is a fear of or discrimination toward gay, lesbian, and bisexual people. Or if it's transphobia, then it would be transgender or other gender nonconforming people, right? So homophobia, right? And cisgenderism is the belief in the superiority of cisgender persons and those identities, right? Those socially constructed categories, right? A privileged category, right, would be cisgenderism. Hegemonic masculinity. So remember, hegemony, right, is the dominant culture supporting the status quo of that dominant culture, right? So let's take a look at the definition. A masculine ideal that promotes characteristics such as these masculine characteristics of independence, aggression, and toughness, and rejects any alternative qualities in men. Okay. Now, I suppose you could also have hegemonic femininity, which would then focus on feminine ideals and promote those characteristics of collective instead of independence, right? Collective, cooperative, and reject the more masculine. So, it's, you can also, there's a yin and a yang, right, to all these definitions, right? Toxic masculinity, a masculine ideal that espouses extreme and harmful attitudes and behaviors and may lead to various negative effects for both women and men, right? Women and men, right? We can talk a little bit more about this in class or in a discussion board. Okay. Gender and language. So language is gendered, right? He as a generic, right? So in our Constitution, right, all men are created equal, right, is kind of the generic use for human, but it's gendered to the masculine, right? Mankind. all men are created equal. We talked about that. Man-made, right? Even in class, sometimes I'll talk about, like a straw man fallacy, right? Or a steel man approach. So fireman, policeman. Now we've worked on changing those things, right? So that we're more gender neutral, right? And trying to take the power structure of patriarchy down, right, to a more equitable and social justice perspective. Okay, sociological approaches. So let's apply these sociological approaches, and then we'll have some fun kind of looking at different data and data points. Okay, so functionalism, right, is a paradigm or a lens that sees, right, gender, or that sex determines which role, right, men and women are best suited to, right? So there's a tends to be, functionalism tends to have a biological component to it at its foundations, right? It is more appropriate for men to play instrumental roles and for women to play expressive roles, okay? And there's some good research that supports a functionalist perspective or paradigm. They've done a lot of research on like infants, like recent born infants, where, for example, one famous study they did is they took babies, right, and they put them in white, right, and then so that the person's face and a mobile, a little mobile. So here's the baby looking up, at the person or the mobile. And what they found is that the male babies tended to focus on the mobile, right, the moving, and the female baby, fascinating, because these were like within a week or two old, right, would focus on the person, the human being. So there is some kind of a biology in there, but that biology difference doesn't mean, right, as we move into this brave new world, right, doesn't mean that we have to oppress one group, or that one group has to be seen or perceived as the ideal, right? Where in the past, in patriarchal societies, based on what we've talked about earlier in this lecture, right, you can see where sexism is the belief that one gender or one sex is superior, right, to the other, right? Now, different doesn't mean superior or inferior. It just means different, and can we, I guess the challenge, right, is can we, which gets us into conflict theory, right, is can we have differences but be equal, right? And then value those differences and those strengths for what they are, and characteristics and differences, right? So conflict theory, right, looks at or sees, or is a paradigm, right, a tool to be used to observe and see that because of traditional division of labor and families, males have had more access to resources and privileges and have sought to maintain their dominance. Okay, so that's how a conflict theorist would, the framework that it would, I said conflict theorist, somebody using a conflict theory approach would use that lens or that paradigm. And then symbolic interactionism, right? So somebody that a researcher or sociologist using interaction, right, is gender is learned through the process of socialization. Okay, gender inequalities are reproduced or changed through interaction, right? The social construction is created or changed through interactions between families, peers, schools, media, those agents of socialization. And if you really want to do an interesting personal kind of application of interactionism, consider female as a symbol, and then think of the adjectives that we use, not that you use, be a sociologist, right? It doesn't have to be, in fact, better to try to pull your own views out and be objective and try to look at society. And how does society represent female, and what are the adjectives you would just use to describe how society, not you, how society sees females? Sometimes we look at how we interact or react to females as opposed to, say, male, and you can do the same thing for male. So how do you perceive, if you observe society, what would be the adjectives to describe male, right? And you can use interactionism. We talked in the last chapter about interactionism. You can do the same for like race and ethnicity, right? You could do the same for like Black and those adjectives, Hispanic and those adjectives, white and those adjectives, Asian and those, or whatever nationality, if you wanted to do that as well. Okay. Let's talk about some interesting studies. So this was a study that was conducted in 2018. The news came out, it was published, and the news came out in at the end of 2018, really kind of hit the surprised sociology, surprised social sciences. It was just like crazy data. So what they found, right? So the hypotheses, let's start with the hypotheses, right? The hypotheses was that if you looked at countries where there was greater wealth and prosperity, right? And you measure that with gross domestic product, or what they call GDP. So the higher the GDP, the greater the lifestyle, the greater the prosperity. And they looked at a gender equity scale. And so the more the culture saw egalitarian gender or equal gender, right? So what they said was, hey, the better the better the prosperity and the more equal we see gender, then the outcomes between the differences between men and women should shrink, right? That because women have been oppressed through patriarchy, right? Given more freedom, given more equality, given more wealth, which gives you freedom, right? That's the idea anyway. Then you would see men and women being more equal. And the results came back just the opposite. It was a shocker. And of course, then there was some interesting commentaries and perspectives, right? Because the outcome was different than we had expected. So if you look at this graph, right? So lower GDP, and higher GDP. So that's one axis, right? And they did it on quartiles. So they looked at countries and they said the poorest 25% in number one, the next 25% in number two, 50 to 75% of the quartile in number three, and then the highest, richest countries in the farthest right in number four. And then on the other axis, the vertical axis, less difference, more difference, right? So the hypothesis was that it should be a downward, as you're going from left to right, it should be a downward line, right? Or a downward curve. So that the more prosperous the country, then then of course there'd be more less difference. In fact, what happened was the more prosperous, so the curve went the other way, or the line went the other way in general, except in the area of positive reciprocity, right? Which I thought was kind of interesting. And you can dig into this and even do some research on your own. And then on the less equal versus more equal countries, and they did a national survey, a random sample of what's the perception of equality along gender lines. And the same thing happened there. It didn't go down, which meant that there would be less difference between male and female. The more that a society equally valued and equally treated genders, the more difference there was. So if you take those things, if you take out the trappings of you have to do these jobs to make a living and survive, or you have to survive the inequalities of gender. If you have the freedom to choose, men and women tended to choose differently. Okay, and here's another graph of the same, different graph but the same. So you have the lower GDP and the higher GDP, and I like this because it kind of and they divided this by in threes, right? So the highest and the smallest. So the largest gender differences were in the countries that had, right, the higher GDPs, the more economic prosperity. And we, of these countries, we were number 2 with the biggest differences between men and women. Now, there are obviously other cultural influences, obviously, right? But you can see Sweden was 4, Australia right down at the, you can, and I'll let you pause this if you want to take a look at it. But, and then countries that were, so US was number 2. So we weren't as more equal thinking as, say, for Sweden is far more gender egalitarian. Now we are in the top, you know, we're in the top 10 or 20%, right? Or maybe certainly 25. What's number 10? Czech Republic. Number 8 is Switzerland. Okay. But less difference or more difference, right? So the countries that had less, down here 73 and 74, Pakistan and Tanzania, had, they saw greater, less equality between the genders, and of course that meant less differences in those factors that you can look at the previous slide and run this back a little bit if you want. So kind of an interesting study that's very recent, kind of a shocker. So I thought that'd be kind of fun to look at. Now, social agents of socialization and gender role socialization, media and gender. Oh man. So in this picture, you can see what the more masculine is, kind of the more aggressive, more assertive. The feminine is helpless and needs to be rescued. So yeah, kind of interesting. So gender roles, right, are coming through. And then how do we see gender in sport and society, you know, in our society? That's starting to change a little bit. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we look at pay gaps. How is media presented, or I mean, how are women presented in movies, right? And do they have to be sexualized or hypersexualized to sell, to be accepted as female? You can still be, I mean, I think the modern day Charlie's Angels movies is a great example of that, right? So you have these tough, and you can think of other movies that have like superheroes that are female, right? But you look at like these tough, kick-ass women, right? And yet they still have to, at some point in the movie, go back to the original new Charlie's Angels, the first one they did with these 3 actresses, right? There was a moment where each of them had a hypersexualized moment. I think the movie opened with Cameron Diaz dancing in her underwear, you know, and then there was that, and maybe even a bit of a racial social construction, kind of a bias there for Lucy Liu, you know, where she was kind of in like that leather and had a whip, and she was up, you know, on a desk giving a speech. And then there was another part where Drew Barrymore, you know, did had a set. So anyway, you understand what I'm saying. So it's really interesting, right? And we have to do the same for men, right? And, you know, for us to kind of accept these guys as guys, right? There has to be kind of a hyper masculinity moving toward that, you know, which is an embellishment, which tends to be movies and Hollywood. But yeah, it's really interesting, the influence, right, that movies have as agents of socialization on who we identify as, or the gender we identify as, and what it means to be that gender, and who are the agents of socialization in that gender role socialization, right? Also, how is the LGBTQ plus community represented, right? Very interesting there as well, right? And the socialization that's happening there. So yeah, very interesting. And then here's gender construction and gender role reversal. Ooh. So these guys, right? These are men, and they're being posed, you know, in what we would typically consider a socially constructed, of course, feminine pose, right? And you look at, you know, a typical reaction would be, whoa, right? Because we're not used to that, because we put men in a feminine pose, right? So we reverse the role. If you get a reaction, it's like, huh, well, that's kind of interesting. What does that tell us about? Because there's nothing biological, right, about this pose as far as gender goes, right? These have been socially constructed poses along gender lines. Also, Disney's famous, or people are famous for doing a Disney gender role reversal, right? So you see up here in the left-hand column, right, a female character's face put on a male character's body. Here's Gaston in Beauty and the Beast, where the female character's face goes on Gaston. And then over here you have Prince Eric in The Little Mermaid, you know, on the mermaid's body. And even a little bit of a gender role socialization or reversal on that. And then here's side by side, you can see the original characters on the right, and then they reverse them out, right? And you can see the facial expressions, the emotion. And so if we've been socialized into these constructed roles, and then, you know, we should have some kind of a, oh, reaction, right? Kind of interesting. Job role reversal. Yeah, my daughter does some whitewater guide rafting, some mountain bike, and it's always interesting the stories she tells, you know, when people are like, wow, are you the guide? And they typically say that because they're surprised, because what our gender norms, right, we don't typically see or believe, or it's not socially constructed, right, to have a female be your raft guide or your mountain bike guide. And so all the beliefs and stereotypes and ideas that are associated, they're socially constructed with gender, right? Same with a nurse, right, a male nurse, which, you know, became kind of this famous meme-ish type of in Meet the Parents, right, with Fokker, right? Oh, you're a male nurse, and they all kind of laugh because his fiance came from a family where the guys were doctors, right? And so that was kind of this funny thing, you know, and of course that was decades ago and things changed now, but yeah, kind of interesting, right? Job role reversal, right? And all the social constructions that go with gender in different jobs and different roles. So kind of fascinating. Body image and culture, right? So every culture is a beauty culture, time and place. So they took one picture, and this was a research project that they did, and they took that one picture and they sent it out to different countries or different marketing graphic artists in different countries, and they said, we want you to put this ad into a magazine, a print ad, and we want you to make it look like it fits your culture. And so you can see that, and of course it's the ideal, kind of an ideal female body, what it looks like in those different cultures: hair color, body size and shape, maybe hairstyle to a certain degree. And then of course, then they did, here's the original in the male version of this, right? And then you can see, maybe this is the United States or United Kingdom, I'm not sure, but you have like Venezuela, and you have, I don't know, maybe South Korea, Nigeria. So yeah, kind of interesting, right? What is considered the ideal, right, in these different countries, which is again kind of gendered to some degree, or it's just definitely this kind of beauty culture thing. But it just goes to show you, right, that there might be some biology, because there are body differences, right, within different cultures along different genome, you know, ancestral trees, right, to some degree. But that's also indicative of a great degree of what differences in how a culture socially constructs the ideal or the norm, right? And then of course, this is interesting. So on the left is what, like, so this top left is what men, let me think about it, is what, okay, so the top left is what men perceive. It's what, okay, so the top left is what women perceive the ideal male body to be. The top right is what males perceive women to perceive the ideal male body. Okay, on the lower left, this is what men perceive to be the ideal female, and this was done in a study. And the right is what women perceive men perceiving to be the ideal female body. So I'll let you kind of think about that and look at that if you want to take a closer look, but kind of another interesting study on gender and beauty and ideals. Okay, and then the gender pay gap, we'll talk about that, right? So women who work full-time make 80 cents for every dollar a male makes working full-time, right? So here's the here's the graph of it, right? Median annual earnings of full-time men and women. Now, why is the difference, right? We have socially constructed gender pay gap. We've socially constructed it to mean, right, is a symbol sexism because it's unequal, right? Maybe, I'm sure there is sexism involved. And how do you even define sexism? Is gender role socialization part of sexism? Yeah, right. To some degree, sure. To what degree? We could debate that, talk about that, right? How much is sexism involved in that 20% difference? I don't know. We could do some research, and there's research out there that people have done and kind of look at that, right? Gender pay gap, right? So if you're, this is another study that's kind of looked at this. So if you're single with no children, okay, and this is the hours worked, right? So if you're single and no children, men tend to work a little bit more hours per week than women. If you're married but no children, right, women work about the same. Men have worked a little bit more. We could have some fun conversations about why that might be. And then if you're married with children, women work again slightly less and men work slightly more. And we could again have some, maybe even some good laughs about why that is. But it is interesting, right? I think this is Pew Research. I know Pew Research did you can go if you go to Pew Research online, it's amazing the resources that you can find on all kinds of social research. Here's gender pay gap based on percentage of men and women in these different job roles and the estimated median base of pay, right? So to the left on the horizontal axis is gender. So to the left on that is more women, to the right on that is more men as a percentage. So you can see, like, say in the upper right, mechanical engineering is probably like 90% male. On the far left, social work's about 16 or 17% female. Let's see, right in the middle, you've got marketing, accounting, maybe a few more females in accounting, a few more males in marketing, maybe a few more males in criminal justice, architecture, more male, healthcare, human resources, anthropology, more females. And then, of course, the vertical axis, so the higher up it goes, the more you're paid, right? And then if you draw a scatter plot line through, right, kind of trying to find that kind of slope, that average slope, you see that what men have higher percentages of representation in jobs that are making more money. Now, is that because men are pressured to be the bread earners and so they gravitate toward that? Is it because in society we tend to value those things that are more masculine? You know, the only one that really breaks a long ways off of this is nursing, right? Where nursing pays pretty darn good and is 20% male, so 80% female. Okay, so kind of interesting. I was trying to think of that one study they did. So some of the studies they've done where it's like you take the top 10 best paying college degrees, men are the majority in 9 of those 10 most highest paid college degrees. If you take a look at the bottom 10, the worst paying college degrees, women are the majority in 9 of those 10, right? So it's kind of interesting, right? Even as we look at where people go to get their degree in those kind of jobs that pay. And maybe if there's pressure on men to make more, because that's a social construct that men have to be the breadwinners, right, to some degree, then maybe there's more pressure on men to take those jobs. Maybe going back to that first slide, maybe in a more prosperous society with or a less prosperous, when there's more pressure to earn and survive, maybe there's less difference. I don't know. I mean, it's complex, right? Here's a gender pay gap by countries, kind of an international perspective, right? So South Korea, the gender pay gap is 36%, Japan 26%, then it drops down to Netherlands, Turkey, Canada, right around 20%, then Australia, and then the US, right? At least in this poll, right? And then the United Kingdom, and then I thought Sweden would, there's Sweden right there at 15%, right? And then France and Germany, Ireland, Italy, Spain, New Zealand, right, has the of these countries has the greatest egalitarian gender pay gap. Okay, so kind of interesting. I thought that'd be interesting to you. And then work. Okay, so this is from Pew Research. They did this amazing study and they looked at so in this graph right here, they compared 1997 to 2010 and 2011, right? It's a little old data, but it's kind of interesting to see where things have shifted. So this is the percentage of 18 to 34-year-olds, okay, that say being successful in a high-paying career profession is one of the most important things or very important in their lives. So you can see back in 1997, there was a higher percentage of men, 58% compared to women, 56%, that said that being successful in a high-paying career profession was either one of the most important or very important. Just in a span of less than 15 years, men stayed about the same. They went up 1%, but look at the women, right? So almost, probably about an 18% increase in women and not much change in men on this question. So what's going on? Something, right? There's a change in the pattern here. So kind of interesting, right? So all of a sudden, and they were pretty close to being equal and women a little bit less. And now a greater gap in this, based on this question, right? And women have reversed that, where now women are saying, 2/3 of women are saying in the age group of 18 to 34, that being successful in a high-paying career profession is one of the most important things, or very important. So what has changed, right? That's what sociologists, we see these patterns, we see these changes, and then we ask why. Why this change? Fascinating, right? Not much of a change for men, a big change for women. Why? Why the change? It's not in the drinking water. We haven't given women some kind of special like Gatorade to drink, right? We haven't, it's not biological, right? I mean, something has changed in the environment, and that'd be kind of interesting to talk about in class or a discussion board, right? Okay, labor force participation rate has risen for women, fallen for men, right? So women are more into the, now it's dipped a little bit. I think that was coming out of the Great Recession in 2008, right? But kind of interesting, right? So men were 86% labor participation rate in 1950, the dip below 70%. Ooh, that's a pretty big dip for men. Increase for women from 34%. And then now it sits at 57%. So almost from 1950 to right before, it was probably almost a doubling, right, in labor participation. So kind of interesting. Again, why, right? That's what we ask, is we ask why. Now, part of it might be there's more stay-at-home men, right? Part of it might be women have had to enter the workforce, to a greater degree to afford what we think now is the norm or is a necessity, maybe to a large degree, or maybe just want to go back to work, right? And have more social freedom within our social norms to go to work, right? Okay. I think this is interesting right here. Moms and dads, 1965 to 2011, the differences, right? 1965, 2011, and they looked at 3 different number of hours per week spent on paid work, housework, and childcare. Now, I didn't look to see what housework was, but I'm not sure that mowing the lawn counts as housework, but it might. But anyway, it's really interesting to look at. So this is mothers and fathers in 1965. Mothers spent 10 hours per week on childcare, fathers 2.5. Housework 32 hours a week by women in 1965 compared to 4 hours by men. And then paid work, mothers 8 hours on, these are averages, right? Men 42. Then you take it to 2011, right? And the overall hours worked per week on these three areas, women 51, men 49. You get to 2011 and women are working 53, so more hours on these three, but not as much as men. So there was a bit of a reversal, not a significantly statistical difference, significant, but it's interesting. But where we spend our time, mothers and fathers, has shifted quite dramatically, right? So more hours in childcare by women and men. And the difference is not as much of a gap percentage-wise, right? So I'd say we're maybe more child-centric today than we were. That could be part of it. And then housework, again, more shared responsibility, as well as paid work shared responsibility, but still unequal and uneven. So, but when you put all those three together, pretty close, right? And a shift, a slight shift. So I thought that would be those, and this Pew Research, I mean, this is 3 of 40 or 50 different slides. This was an amazing, a large number of people participated in this random sample, gender in the workplace, and lots of data collected. So these are just 3 that I picked out that I thought was interesting. Okay. I'll let you kind of look at this because it's pretty, but I thought you'd find this interesting as far as females CEOs, percentage of CEOs number over the years, and you can kind of look at where those are. So Fortune 500 CEOs, who are they, male or female? You can see in 2000, right, 95%, or since 2000, I guess, 95% male, 5% female, right? And this is when we talk about patriarchy, this is what's very common to look at would be Fortune 500 CEOs and say who is in the Senate, right, along gender lines. Okay. Now, education. So this is, I'll let you look at this. Reading and math skills, right? So math was the big advantage that boys tended to have over girls, right? And you can see that the gap is in 4th grade is 1, 8th grade is 1, and in grade 12 is 3. Now now for reading, so there's a bigger gap in reading between boys and girls. So boys are at a deficit in reading, girls are at a deficit in math. But if you look at both, it's males, it's boys that are at a greater deficit when you put them both together. So that's kind of interesting. And there are more women that are enrolled in college, and more women graduate from undergrad, master's degree, and PhDs, more women graduating at all 3 of those levels now than men. So women are more educated, or at least more degreed, right? More educated. And also, if you look at the college gap by race and gender, so we've added one more factor in there, right? So a little bit of intersectionality, but kind of interesting, right? So white men and white women, and black men and black women and black men, and you see over time, right? You see, boy, so something happened around 1980 where males leveled or declined, but now kind of going up, but look at that trajectory for white women, and for that matter for black women, but there's still a gap, right? There's still a gap. Now it's kind of interesting, right? 1950, kind of interesting. Okay. So I'll let you look at that. And then the global glass ceiling. So this is percentage of managers that were female in 2015. Latvia was number 1, right? So 40% of managers were women, 54% were men. In the United States, 43% women, 57% men. That's kind of interesting. And so so US, of the countries in, that were ranked, US was number 2, right? And still not 50-50, but you have Iceland, France, Slovenia, Sweden. Wow, Sweden, who kind of gets like the gold star, the gold standard for gender egalitarianism. Sweden was only a little more than 1/3 women and 2/3 men in managers' positions. Huh. So yeah, Norway, which is another Nordic country that tends to be known for. Iceland, pretty good though. Iceland got up there. New Zealand, pretty good. All right. So kind of interesting. I thought I'd throw that. And then here's the likelihood. This is from the same study. The likelihood of women reaching managerial positions. The likelihood, right? So the likelihood. So it's 100 is a score of 100 is equal opportunity as men. So there's an equal chance a woman will be reaching a managerial position as a man has. So equal chances or opportunities, right? Equal opportunity. I don't know how you measure opportunity, but probably equal chances of getting there, right? Includes public sector. So the United States of these countries was number 1 at 85, right? High, but not perfect. New Zealand, of course, no surprise there, but Mexico, France, Spain, Hungary, Australia, Italy, Canada, the UK. I think I grabbed this, and this is the color. So you had kind of the British, the Anglo-Saxon, oh, there it is, Anglo-Saxon and kind of the blue, and the Nordic countries, which are kind of known for gender egalitarian in red. So so the area where you've got a country, where you have countries that are wealthy and yeah, kind of interesting, right? And egalitarian. So I don't know, I'll let you take a look at that and you can interpret it for what it is. And then I thought this was kind of interesting. Highest paid athletes salaries, men versus women, right? So soccer, and I think this is, they say football, but it's soccer, right? The difference between male and female pay. And I'll let you look at this too, but basketball, MMA fighting, boxing, of course, tennis has worked really hard to have a more gender equitable pay outcome. Okay, so I'll let you look at that if you want to pause. And then the pink tax, right? It says what costs more for women, more for women spend more on personal care products, women spend more on adult clothing, and the list goes on, right? And we'll maybe have a chance to talk about that in class, but so the pink tax, basically the pink tax is that you pay more for products, goods, and services if you're female than you do if you're male. Although women do make 85% of retail purchases women make. A lot of power in purchasing power, and that's why women get advertised to a lot, and a lot of advertising for retail products. Okay, so that's the pink tax. And then politics, I've talked a little bit about that, but I just threw this in because you have an overwhelming number of men in power, in positions of power, and within our government. That's changing and continues to change. Yeah, very interesting, right? Throw a little Carol Gilligan's research in there about the differences between how men and women see right and wrong and justice, right? And that'll be it's kind of an interesting dynamic. But anyway, so politics and patriarchy and representation. So kind of interesting. So that kind of wraps it up for today, for this lecture. I hope that was informative and helpful, and we'll see you next time.